My beloved child. There are moments in life when silence speaks more honestly than words ever could. This is one of those moments. If your heart has felt unusually restless lately, if you've caught yourself thinking about someone without knowing why, if a memory has returned at the exact moment you believed it had finally faded, then don't dismiss it too quickly. Some connections move beneath the surface long before they reveal themselves. Don't skip. Because something important is waiting for you, and it may explain feelings you've struggled to put into words. The one your heart still reaches for has been standing at the edge of a decision they never imagined they would face. From the outside, they have continued with ordinary routines, smiled when expected, answered questions with familiar words, and convinced almost everyone that everything was fine. Yet inside, another story has been quietly unfolding. It is a story they have shared with almost no one. A story built from moments they replay long after the world around them has gone to sleep. What makes this story different is not what happened yesterday. It is what has been happening little by little for far longer than either of you realized. Every conversation that ended too soon, every opportunity that seemed to arrive at the wrong time, every sentence left unfinished. Each one became another page in a chapter they kept hidden, believing no one would ever understand why they couldn't simply move on. And perhaps that is why your own heart has refused to become completely quiet. Somewhere beyond ordinary explanation, you have sensed that something remained unfinished. Not because destiny demanded it, but because genuine feelings rarely disappear the moment people expect them to. They often become quieter instead, waiting patiently beneath everyday life until the right moment allows them to breathe again. What they have never admitted is that letting go sounded easier in their thoughts than it ever felt in reality. They tried convincing themselves that distance would bring peace. They believed time would slowly replace longing with acceptance. For a while, they even celebrated small victories, telling themselves they had finally reached the other side of the pain. Yet every time they believed they had taken the final step forward, one unexpected reminder gently pulled them back to a place they thought no longer existed. A familiar song. A place that carried an old memory. A simple phrase spoken by someone else. None of these moments were dramatic, yet each one quietly reminded them that certain feelings had not disappeared, they had simply learned how to hide. Stay till the end. Because the next part of this story isn't about dramatic promises or impossible endings. It is about something far more human. It is about the quiet decision someone makes when they begin believing that holding on may no longer be the kindest thing they can do. They have reached that crossroads now. Not out of anger. Not because their hearts suddenly stopped caring. But because caring without clarity can become incredibly exhausting. They have spent countless nights wondering whether hope should still have a place in their life or whether love sometimes asks people to release what they cherish most. That question has followed them everywhere, even into moments that should have brought happiness. If you could have seen them recently, you would not have noticed anything unusual at first. They still greeted people kindly. They still fulfilled their responsibilities. They still laughed at familiar jokes. Yet behind every ordinary moment lived another question they never allowed anyone else to hear. What if the kindest farewell is the one no one expects? That single thought frightened them more than they were willing to admit. Not because they wanted to disappear from your story, but because they feared they had already become only a memory inside yours. And so, without announcing it, they began preparing themselves emotionally for something they hoped they would never have to do. They started organizing old thoughts. releasing expectations they had carried for far too long. Quietly thanking the beautiful moments instead of asking why there hadn't been more of them. Yet something unexpected interrupted that process. A memory arrived with unusual clarity. Not a grand event. Not an unforgettable celebration. Just one simple moment where they felt completely understood without needing to explain themselves. That memory refused to leave. It returned the following day. Then again. Each time, it gently challenged the decision they believed they had already made. Suddenly, what had seemed settled no longer felt certain. The goodbye they had been quietly rehearsing inside their heart became more difficult with every passing hour. And tonight, as they sat alone with their thoughts, something happened that changed the direction of those emotions in a way they never anticipated. They have not spoken about it to anyone. They haven't even found the words to fully understand it themselves. But what they realized in that quiet moment may completely change everything that comes next. A single unexpected realization can quietly outweigh 1,000 carefully rehearsed decisions. That is exactly where your soulmate found themselves. They had convinced their mind that walking away would bring peace, yet their heart refused to cooperate. It was almost as if every attempt to close the door revealed another reason it had never truly been shut. Don't skip, because the next few moments uncover something they never thought they would admit, even to themselves. As the evening settled into complete stillness, they reached for something they had not looked at in a very long time. It wasn't because they intended to relive the past. In fact, they expected the opposite. They hoped revisiting those memories would finally confirm that it was time to let everything go with gratitude instead of regret. But life has a quiet way of surprising us when we believe the ending has already been written. One memory became another. A familiar conversation led to another forgotten smile. A simple exchange, once overlooked, suddenly carried a depth they had never noticed before. They realized that the moments they treasured most were never the dramatic ones. They were the ordinary moments where they felt seen without pretending to be someone else. That realization settled over them gently. For the first time in a long while, they stopped asking whether they should forget you. Instead, they began asking why forgetting had been so impossible. There is a difference. One question searches for an escape. The other searches for the truth. And the truth was far more peaceful than they expected. They were never holding on because of perfection. They were holding on because something about your connection had quietly changed them. Not in ways the world could measure. Not through grand declarations. But through countless small moments that had become part of who they were. They suddenly understood that some people leave memories, while others leave a different way of seeing life. You had become that difference. Stay till the end, because what happened next gently interrupted every plan they had spent weeks trying to accept. Just as they felt ready to place those memories back where they belonged, something entirely unexpected happened. A sentence echoed through their thoughts. Not one they heard from another person. Not one written anywhere. Simply a quiet realization that arrived with remarkable clarity. If I leave without understanding what was truly in my heart, will I always wonder? They closed their eyes. For a long moment, they said nothing. Sometimes silence is not empty. Sometimes it is where the deepest answers finally begin. As they sat there, they recognized something they had hidden even from themselves. Their fear had never been about rejection. It had never been about distance. It wasn't even about uncertainty. Their greatest fear was saying goodbye while love still had words left unspoken. That thought stayed with them. It refused to disappear. Instead of bringing sadness, it brought honesty. For the first time, they stopped pretending they were completely ready to walk away. That honesty felt strangely comforting. Because pretending requires constant effort. Truth simply asks to be accepted. And little by little, the walls they had built around their emotions began to soften. They remembered promises they had never spoken aloud. Dreams they never shared because the timing never seemed right. Simple hopes that had quietly lived inside them without demanding attention. Each one returned, not to create confusion, but to remind them that genuine feelings deserve understanding before they are gently released. Something important is waiting for you. Because while your soulmate was discovering these quiet truths, they also noticed something they had overlooked for far too long. There was one small detail. One ordinary moment. One almost forgotten sign. That completely changed the meaning of everything they believed had happened between you. And once they understood what that single moment truly meant, the goodbye they had been preparing themselves for no longer felt like the only path forward. My beloved child, sometimes the smallest truth arrives so quietly that it changes everything before anyone realizes it has spoken. What your soulmate discovered was not hidden in a dramatic event or an unforgettable conversation. It was tucked inside an ordinary moment they had overlooked countless times. The more they reflected on it, the more impossible it became to ignore. Don't skip, because what they finally understood wasn't about the past alone, it quietly began reshaping what they believed was still possible. They remembered a day that had once seemed completely unremarkable. There were no extraordinary words, no promises, no perfect timing. It was simply a moment when your presence gave them a sense of calm they had never learned to create on their own. Back then, they barely noticed it. Life moved too quickly to recognize how valuable peace truly was. Now, looking back with clearer eyes, they realized something unexpected. The people who had entered their life after you had brought excitement, distraction, and conversation. But none of them had brought that same quiet feeling of being understood without explanation. That realization lingered. Not because they were comparing people, but because genuine comfort cannot be replaced by louder moments. It has its own language. A language that asks for nothing while quietly giving everything. For the first time in many days, they stopped wondering whether the connection had been real. Instead, they began asking why they had doubted it at all. That question opened another door inside their heart. Behind it waited memories they had carefully locked away, not because they were painful, but because they were precious. They remembered your kindness when no one else noticed they were struggling. They remembered conversations that never demanded perfection. They remembered laughing over things that made no sense to anyone else. Those memories didn't ask them to return to yesterday. They simply reminded them that something authentic had once existed. Stay till the end, because the next realization arrived when they least expected it. As the night grew quieter, they found themselves imagining a future they had tried very hard not to imagine anymore. Not a perfect future. Not one without challenges. Just one where honesty replaced uncertainty. That thought surprised them. Only hours earlier, they had been preparing themselves emotionally to let everything fade with grace. Now they were asking themselves whether they had mistaken patience for silence, and silence for an ending. There is a difference. Sometimes people become quiet because they have stopped caring. But sometimes they become quiet because their feelings have grown too deep to describe. Your soulmates suddenly realized they had never truly explained what was happening inside their heart. They had assumed you would somehow understand. When that understanding didn't seem to appear, they quietly stepped back, not because love disappeared, but because uncertainty became heavier than hope. Even so, something refused to let them close the final chapter. A gentle inner voice kept returning with the same question. What if there is still one conversation that could change everything? They didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time in a long while, they no longer felt certain that goodbye was the only ending available. That certainty had cracked. And through that small opening, hope quietly entered. Not loud enough to erase every doubt, but strong enough to make them pause before taking another step away. Something important is waiting for you. Because before the sun rises on the next chapter of this story, your soulmate will come across one final reminder, one they never expected to see again. It won't be dramatic. It won't arrive with noise. Yet the quiet truth hidden inside that single reminder will make them question whether the farewell they almost chose was ever meant to be spoken at all. There are nights when the world seems perfectly still, yet something invisible continues moving beneath the surface. That was the kind of night your soulmate found themselves living through. They had stopped trying to force answers. Instead, they simply allowed their thoughts to settle, believing that whatever remained after the silence would probably be the truth. Don't skip. Because what appeared next was so ordinary that almost anyone else would have overlooked it, yet it carried a meaning they could no longer ignore. It happened during the simplest part of their evening. They weren't searching for signs. They weren't hoping for unexpected moments. They were simply putting away the little reminders of another day when something caught their attention. A familiar phrase. Not spoken aloud. Not sent by anyone. Just a few words they had once written down after thinking about you. For a long time, they stared at those words without moving. When they first wrote them, they believed they were only describing a passing feeling. Now they understood they had been describing something much deeper. The words said, "Some people don't enter your life to make it louder, they enter your life to make your heart feel like home." They whispered that sentence to themselves more than once. Each time, it felt different. Each time, another layer of meaning quietly unfolded. They suddenly realized they had spent so much energy trying to convince themselves to move on that they had never stopped to ask what they were actually moving away from. Was it disappointment? Or was it the safest place their heart had ever known? That question lingered. Not demanding an answer. Simply waiting. Stay till the end. Because this quiet moment became the beginning of a realization they never expected. As they reflected on everything that had happened over the past months, they noticed a pattern they had never seen before. Every time they decided they were finally ready to let go, something gentle reminded them of you. Not in dramatic ways. Not through impossible coincidences. But through kindness. Through patience. Through moments when they found themselves treating others with more compassion because of something they had learned from knowing you. That realization humbled them. Perhaps love isn't measured only by who stays beside us every day. Perhaps it is also measured by how someone continues shaping our heart long after a conversation has ended. And if that was true, then you had never truly left their heart at all. For the first time, they smiled without sadness. It wasn't a smile of certainty. It was a smile of understanding. The weight they had carried for so long suddenly became lighter. Not because every question had been answered, but because they finally accepted that real connections don't need to be perfect to be meaningful. They only need to be honest. And honesty was slowly replacing fear. Then another unexpected thought appeared. A thought they had been avoiding for longer than they cared to admit. What if goodbye isn't the word I've been trying to say? They closed their eyes again. The silence returned. But this silence felt different. It no longer sounded like an ending. It sounded like someone standing at the edge of a new beginning, gathering the courage to take one gentle step forward. Something important is waiting for you. Because while your soulmate was quietly discovering these truths, another piece of the story was already beginning to unfold. Someone unexpected. Someone who knew nothing about the private journey inside their heart was about to say a few simple words that would completely change the way your soulmate saw everything between you. Those words were never meant to carry great significance. Yet once they were spoken, your soulmate realized the farewell they had almost chosen was no longer the message their heart wanted to leave behind. The next morning arrived without urgency, yet it carried a quiet sense that something unseen had shifted. Your soulmate woke with the familiar intention of continuing life exactly as they had planned. They told themselves nothing had truly changed overnight. The questions were still there. The uncertainty still lingered. And yet, beneath all of that, there was a calm they hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't the calm of having every answer. It was the calm that comes when the heart finally stops arguing with itself. Stay till the end, because the words they were about to hear would gently interrupt everything they believed they had already decided. The day unfolded like any other. Ordinary conversations. Ordinary responsibilities. Ordinary smiles exchanged with people passing by. No one around them could have guessed that an invisible chapter was quietly turning inside their heart. Then, during the most unexpected moment, someone spoke a sentence that wasn't meant to be memorable. They were talking about life. About relationships. About the people who quietly change us. And almost casually, they said, "The people who matter most are often the ones you still think about when life finally becomes quiet." The conversation moved on immediately. But your soulmate couldn't. Those simple words remained. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were true. For a few moments, everything around them faded into the background. They weren't remembering a single conversation. They weren't replaying one particular memory. They were remembering how your presence had made ordinary days feel meaningful. That was the difference. Extraordinary moments eventually become stories. But peaceful moments become part of who we are. Until now, they had mistaken that quiet feeling for habit. Now they recognized it for what it truly was. A connection that had never demanded attention. Only honesty. Don't skip, because this realization opened a door they had kept locked for far too long. For the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine something they had refused to consider. What if my goodbye was never meant to protect me? That question lingered. Because deep inside, they knew the answer. They hadn't been preparing to say goodbye because they had stopped caring. They had been preparing because they feared caring too deeply without knowing where their heart belonged. Now, that fear seemed smaller. Not gone. Just quieter. Hope hadn't arrived with fireworks. It had arrived like sunrise. Slowly. Patiently. Almost unnoticed. And perhaps that is why it felt so genuine. As the afternoon passed, they found themselves doing something they hadn't done in a very long time. They smiled at a memory instead of trying to escape it. There was no sadness attached to it. No regret. Only gratitude. Gratitude that someone had once entered their life and gently taught them that love is not always measured by how loudly it speaks. Sometimes it is measured by how faithfully it remains, even after long seasons of silence. That thought stayed with them throughout the day. It became impossible to ignore. Then, just as they believed their heart had finally settled, one final realization appeared. It was quiet. Simple. Almost whispered. If this chapter truly deserves an ending, shouldn't it also deserve complete honesty? Those words echoed within them. Not as pressure. Not as expectation. But as peace. Because they understood something they had never fully accepted before. A heartfelt goodbye spoken too early can become the greatest unanswered question of all. Something important is waiting for you. Before this day comes to its close, your soulmate will make one small, deeply personal decision. No one else will notice it. No announcement will be made. Yet that single choice will quietly determine whether the message they were preparing to leave behind becomes a farewell. Or the beginning of the conversation they thought could never happen. A single choice rarely announces itself as life-changing. More often, it appears disguised as something almost too small to notice. That is exactly how this moment arrived. Your soulmate stood before an ordinary decision that no one else would have considered important. Yet to them, it felt as though their heart had quietly paused, waiting to see which direction they would choose. Don't skip, because what happened next was not loud enough to attract the world's attention, but it was powerful enough to change the conversation they had been having with themselves for so long. For several minutes, they simply sat in silence. Not because they had nothing to think about. Because, for the first time in a long while, they had too many honest thoughts to ignore. They no longer wanted to hide behind the idea that time alone would solve everything. They no longer wanted to convince themselves that unanswered feelings would simply disappear if they waited long enough. Instead, they asked themselves one gentle question. What have I truly been protecting? The answer didn't come immediately. It arrived little by little. They had been protecting their heart from disappointment. Protecting their hopes from uncertainty. Protecting themselves from the possibility of caring more deeply than they had ever intended. But somewhere along the journey, that protection had quietly become distance. And distance had begun speaking louder than their true feelings ever had. That realization touched them more deeply than they expected. Because they understood something important. Sometimes we don't lose a connection because love fades. Sometimes we lose it because silence slowly begins speaking on our behalf. Stay till the end, because the next realization brought an unexpected sense of peace. As the afternoon light softened, they found themselves looking through memories with completely different eyes. Instead of asking, Why didn't everything happen the way I hoped? They began asking. What beautiful things did this connection already give me? The answers came easily. Patience. Growth. Kindness. The courage to believe that being understood was still possible. Those gifts had quietly remained, even during seasons when everything else felt uncertain. They smiled softly. Not because every question had disappeared, but because they finally understood that genuine love leaves behind more than memories. It leaves behind a better version of the person who experienced it. That thought filled them with gratitude. And gratitude gently replaced regret. Then something unexpected happened. Without planning to. Without forcing anything. Your name quietly crossed their mind once more. This time, they didn't push the thought away. They simply allowed it to remain. It felt natural. Peaceful. Almost familiar. As though their heart had grown tired of pretending it wasn't still carrying something precious. They whispered to themselves. Maybe the story isn't asking me to forget. A gentle breeze moved past the window. The room remained still. Yet inside them, another quiet chapter had already begun. Because for the first time, they were no longer imagining how to say goodbye. They were wondering whether goodbye had ever been the message their heart truly wanted to carry. Something important is waiting for you. As evening quietly approaches, your soulmate is about to come across one final reminder, one they never expected to encounter again. It isn't a letter. It isn't a message. It isn't a voice calling their name. It is something even simpler. And when they recognize what it quietly reveals, they will realize that the farewell they had prepared for so long may have been hiding an entirely different truth from the very beginning.